The Forgotten Asylum. The Dare. It started like most reckless adventures, a dare. A group of 5 friends, bound by years of shared experiences and late-night horror stories, found themselves looking for their next thrill. The old town of Hollow Creek had long since fallen into a quiet routine of mundane life, but one thing remained constant, the presence of the Hollow Creek Asylum. The abandoned structure sat on the outskirts of town, forgotten by time but steeped in legend. Local lore whispered of terrible things, inhumane experiments, unspeakable horrors, and the mysterious disappearance of the asylum's lead doctor, Dr. Everett Crane. The asylum had been closed abruptly decades ago, and no one dared set foot there since. But for Chris, Leah, Danny, Sarah, and Mike, the asylum represented the ultimate challenge. They had explored every haunted house and abandoned lot in the area. But the asylum? That was different. It wasn't just scary, it was legendary. One night, Chris proposed as they gathered at the local diner. One night inside Hollow Creek Asylum, and we document everything. Video, photos, the works. The others were hesitant at first, but Chris was persuasive. Soon enough, what had begun as a ridiculous suggestion turned into a fully fledged plan. They armed themselves with flashlights, cameras, and a vague sense of adventure. Little did they know, the asylum was waiting for them. As the group approached the asylum, the oppressive atmosphere became immediately palpable. The structure loomed in the moonlight like a monolith, towering over the surrounding woods. Vines had long since claimed the walls, and the windows were nothing but gaping black holes. "This place feels wrong," Leah murmured, clutching her jacket tighter. The cool autumn wind sent chills down her spine, but it wasn't the breeze that unnerved her, it was the silence. The asylum felt like a place out of time, as though it existed in a vacuum where life had no place. Mike laughed nervously. "It's just an old building, guys. Come on." The metal gates, long rusted and bent out of shape, screeched as Chris pushed them open. The sound echoed into the night, as if the asylum was screaming in protest. Once inside, they walked cautiously toward the main entrance. The door, heavy and made of rotting wood, gave way with a groan. The air inside was thick with dust and decay. Their flashlights flickered across peeling walls, crumbling furniture, and old, rusted medical equipment. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something metallic. "Okay," Chris said, adjusting the camera strap to his shoulder. "Let's split up. We'll cover more ground that way." "No way," Sarah snapped. "Splitting up is how people die in horror movies." Chris shrugged. "All right, we stick together. Let's check out the first floor." The group began exploring, their footsteps echoing through the hallways as they moved through the asylum's main rooms. There were patient records strewn about the floor, broken glass crunching beneath their feet. But it wasn't until they found the old treatment rooms that the first signs of something truly sinister began to surface. In one of the rooms, they found a table covered in dust and grime, with thick, leather straps still attached to its sides. On a shelf against the wall were rusted surgical instruments, scalpels, bone saws, and needles that seemed disturbingly oversized. Leah stepped back, her flashlight catching a reflection in the corner. There, written on the wall in what looked like dried blood, was a message. "They never leave." Her heart pounded. "Guys, look." The group gathered around the message, the same question on everyone's mind: who wrote it? And why was it still here after all these years? "Probably just some prankster," Danny said, though his voice wavered. "People break into places like this all the time." But as they ventured deeper into the asylum, the unsettling discoveries multiplied. The sound of dripping water echoed through the halls, but when they checked for the source, they found no leaks, no standing water, nothing. Chris's camera picked up strange interference, flickering with static whenever they entered certain rooms, especially the ones used for electroshock therapy. It was as though the asylum itself was reacting to their presence. As they continued, Sarah suddenly stopped in her tracks. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. Everyone froze, listening intently. There it was again, footsteps, coming from the hallway behind them. Mike laughed nervously. "Okay, this place is getting to me, I swear I heard that." Chris turned to face the dark hallway behind them. "Someone else here?" The group turned as one, shining their flashlights down the long, decrepit corridor. At the far end, just at the edge of the light, a figure stood. It was a man. Or, at least, it looked like a man. Dressed in what appeared to be a doctor's coat, the figure remained perfectly still, its head tilted to one side as though studying them. "Who the hell is that?" Danny whispered. Before anyone could answer, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. "Follow him!" Chris shouted, already sprinting down the hall. "Are you insane?" Leah cried. But Chris was already halfway down the corridor, his camera shaking as he ran. The others had no choice but to follow. They chased the figure through the maze-like hallways, but every time they thought they were close, the figure would disappear around another corner, leaving only silence in its wake. Eventually, they found themselves in front of a set of metal double doors, the words, "Medical Wing," barely visible through the grime. The group hesitated, but Chris, ever the thrill-seeker, pushed through the doors. The air here was colder, and the smell of decay was stronger. "It feels different here," Sarah muttered, her voice trembling. They moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The rooms here were smaller, more contained, with padded walls and reinforced doors. This was where the asylum had kept its most dangerous patients. At the end of the hall, they found an office. The plaque on the door read, "Dr. Everett Crane." "This is it," Mike said, "the guy who ran this place." Inside, the room was eerily preserved, papers were still scattered across the desk, as though Dr. Crane had left in a hurry, but it was the journal sitting open on the desk that caught their attention. Chris flipped through it, reading aloud. "They're not patients, they're experiments." The journal detailed Dr. Crane's descent into madness. He had used the patients as subjects in his twisted experiments, pushing the boundaries of human endurance and sanity. The deeper they read, the more horrific the revelations became. The asylum wasn't just a place for the mentally ill, it was a laboratory for torture. Then, a page stopped Chris cold. Written in large, erratic handwriting were the words. "The experiments didn't stop. They live. They walk." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway again, closer this time. Sarah backed away from the desk, her face pale. "We need to leave. Now." But as they turned to exit, the door slammed shut. Panic set in as they tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the lights flickered violently. Then, from the shadows, a voice, a raspy, inhuman whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." The figure of the doctor appeared again, but this time, it wasn't human. His skin was pallid, his eyes sunken, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. He moved toward them, his steps slow and deliberate. "Open the door." Chris shouted, but it was no use. Suddenly, the walls began to shake, and the room felt like it was collapsing in on itself. Shadows flickered in the corners, growing larger and darker. Then, with a deafening crash, the windows shattered, and the room was plunged into complete darkness. For a moment, there was silence, then, a scream. When the lights flickered back on, Danny was gone. The friends were in a nightmare they couldn't escape. Danny had vanished without a trace, leaving only a chilling sense of dread behind. Desperation consumed the group as they stumbled through the asylum's corridors, searching for a way out. But the deeper they went, the more the building seemed to shift around them, trapping them in its twisted labyrinth. The presence of Dr. Crane lingered everywhere they turned, his ghostly figure watching, always watching. As the night wore on, the group dwindled, one by one, until only Chris and Leah remained. Exhausted and terrified, they found themselves back in the asylum's entrance hall, where they had begun. But the doors were no longer there. The way out had disappeared. The asylum had claimed them, just as it had claimed so many before. And in the silence that followed, only the whispers of the dead remained. The asylum was swallowing them whole. After their friends vanished one by one, only Chris and Leah were left, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. The shadows seemed to thicken around them as they stumbled through the winding hallways, searching desperately for any sign of escape. Then, the cold air shifted, and from the darkness, the twisted figure of Dr. Crane appeared once again. His pale, sunken face seemed to grin with malice as he spoke in that chilling, raspy voice. "If you want to see your friends again, if you want to leave, follow the light." Before Chris could react, a faint glow flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the decrepit floor. It was like a beacon, pulling them deeper into the asylum. But Leah hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. "This is a trap," she whispered, gripping Chris's arm, "it has to be." But what choice did they have? With no other options, they began to follow the light. As they ventured deeper, the asylum seemed to change around them. The walls narrowed, and the air grew colder. The light was still there, faint but steady, leading them through the twisted labyrinth. But the path it led them down was anything but safe. The first sign of something wrong came when they passed a set of old, rusted doors. The flickering light illuminated the word agony scrawled in faded paint across one of the doors. "Chris, look," Leah whispered. Without thinking, Chris pushed the door open. What they saw inside froze them to the core. Rows of metal tables, each with heavy leather straps, lined the room. The instruments scattered across the tables were nightmarish, surgical tools, long rusted and stained with something dark. Some of the tables still had skeletons strapped to them, twisted in grotesque poses. A scream tore through the room, echoing off the walls. But it wasn't from Chris or Leah, it was from the shadows themselves. Faint and distant, it sounded like the tortured souls who had once suffered here were still trapped, reliving their agony for eternity. Chris grabbed Leah's hand. "We need to keep moving." But the asylum wasn't done with them yet. They followed the light further down the hall, but as they turned a corner, they found themselves in a strange, mirrored hallway. The walls were lined with tall, grimy mirrors that distorted their reflections in horrific ways. Chris's reflection seemed to stare back at him with hollow, sunken eyes, while Leah's face was twisted into a grotesque, nightmarish grin. "This can't be real," Leah whispered, stepping away from the mirrors, but as she did, her reflection didn't follow, it stayed frozen in the mirror, watching them. Then the mirrors began to whisper. At first, it was faint, like the wind rustling through the leaves, but soon it grew louder, more insistent. Voices, dozens of them, speaking all at once. "They're waiting, they're watching." Chris covered his ears, but it was no use. The voices were in his head, gnawing at his sanity. Just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the light flickered again, pulling them out of the nightmare. But the further they went, the worse it became. The light led them down a narrow staircase that spiraled into the earth, the air growing colder with each step. The further they descended, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It felt as though the weight of the asylum's dark history was pressing down on them, suffocating them with every breath. Leah paused at one point, clutching her chest. I can't breathe down here." But Chris urged her on, "We're close. We have to be." At the bottom of the staircase, they found a massive iron door, partially open, creaking on its hinges. Beyond it, they could hear faint whispers, and the light that had guided them flickered ominously. They pushed the door open and stepped into what could only be described as the catacombs of the asylum. The walls here were made of crumbling stone, and the air was damp and suffocating. Strange symbols were carved into the stone, glowing faintly in the dim light. It was clear that this part of the asylum had never been meant for patients. It was a place of rituals, a place of horror. As they moved through the winding tunnels, they could hear the faint sound of chains rattling, the deeper they went, the more the sound grew, until they came upon a large, iron-bolted door at the end of the hallway. The light had led them here. Chris pushed the door open, and there they were, Danny, Mike, and Sarah, strapped to chairs, their wrists bound by chains. "Help!" Mike screamed, his voice hoarse from shouting. Chris and Leah rushed to them, frantically untying their friends, but something was wrong. As they worked, Leah noticed something chilling: the walls of the room were slowly closing in. They freed Mike, Sarah, and Danny, but just as they did, Chris turned to the door and froze. The door they had entered through, the only way out, was gone. "It was right here," Chris muttered, panic rising in his chest. He pressed his hands against the cold stone wall where the door had been, but there was no trace of it. It was as though the door had never existed. Leah's heart raced. What's happening? The walls were still closing in, inch by inch, and the air was growing colder. The light that had led them here flickered wildly, as though it was struggling to stay alive. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder this time, and more menacing. "You shouldn't have come, you belong to the asylum now." The light blinked out entirely, plunging them into darkness, but then, from the shadows, they heard it, the slow, deliberate footsteps of Dr. Crane. The doctor's twisted figure appeared once more, but this time, he was different. His body seemed to be decaying before their eyes, his skin hanging loosely from his bones. His voice was a rasping whisper. "You didn't listen, you didn't follow the rules." Chris stepped forward, his fists clenched. "What do you want from us?" Dr. Crane's hollow eyes gleamed in the darkness. "This asylum is mine, you are mine." Before anyone could react, the doctor raised his hand, and the room shifted, the walls began to warp, and the ground beneath them trembled. It was as if the asylum itself was alive, bending to Dr. Crane's will. The walls suddenly stopped closing in, but the floor beneath them began to crumble. The group stumbled, desperately trying to stay on their feet as the ground cracked open, revealing a void beneath them. Leah screamed as she was pulled toward the edge, but Chris grabbed her just in time. "Hold on." But it was no use. One by one, they began to fall into the darkness below. The sensation was disorienting, as though they were falling for hours. When they finally hit the ground, they found themselves back at the entrance of the asylum, the same place they had started. Only something was wrong, very wrong. The asylum was no longer abandoned. It was full of life, patients, doctors, nurses, moving about as though the asylum had never closed. We're trapped," Sarah whispered in horror. As the group stumbled through the asylum, they realized the truth. The asylum had never let them leave. They were stuck in a loop, a nightmare that would never end. Dr. Crane's twisted experiments had extended beyond the physical. They were trapped in his creation, doomed to repeat the same horrors over and over. Chris turned to Leah, his voice hoarse. "There has to be a way out." But Leah shook her head. "This is his world now, we're just prisoners." Dr. Crane's voice echoed through the halls, laughing softly. "Welcome to eternity." As the sound of Dr. Crane's sinister laughter faded into the darkness, the ground beneath the group began to shake violently. The floor cracked and crumbled, sending them all tumbling into the depths below. Their screams echoed through the asylum as they fell, their bodies plummeting into an unknown abyss. With a bone-rattling thud, they landed in a cold, dimly lit room. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay filled their lungs. As they struggled to their feet, the realization dawned on them. This room had no doors, no windows, just four walls, trapping them like rats in a maze. At the center of the room, 5 identical beds were lined up, eerily pristine amidst the filth. Next to the beds, a large, wooden box sat ominously. Its lid was slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for them. Chris, Leah, Mike, Danny, and Sarah huddled together, their hearts pounding in their chests, too terrified to move, but something about the box drew them in, compelling them to look inside. It was as if the box held answers they didn't want, but couldn't resist. Leah, trembling, took a step forward. "We have to know, we have to see." With shaking hands, she lifted the lid. The contents inside made their blood run cold. 5 thick, old files, each one marked with a name. their names, each of them had a file. Chris picked up his own and flipped it open, his breath catching in his throat. The pages were filled with his personal information, his medical history, his date of birth, every small detail of his life meticulously documented. But there was one entry that made his heart stop. It was a surgical schedule. The date of his surgery was marked for today, right now. He looked at the others, their faces pale with horror as they opened their files and found the same thing. Each of them was scheduled for surgery today. Each file included grim details of the operations, procedures they had never agreed to, surgeries that should never happen. How is this possible? Danny stammered, how do they know all this? Before anyone could answer, a low hum filled the room, like the sound of machinery coming to life. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the asylum itself was waking up. Suddenly, the beds began to shift, their frames groaning as they were pushed into a neat formation, as if preparing for use. Surgical tools, rusted and covered in dried blood, appeared on trays beside each bed, glinting menacingly in the dim light. Chris stumbled backward, his mind racing. We have to get out of here. We have to. Before he could finish, a door appeared in the wall. It was small, barely noticeable, but it hadn't been there before. The air around it shimmered, as though it wasn't entirely real. Do we go through? Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. But before they could decide, a voice echoed through the room. It wasn't Dr. Crane's voice this time. It was deeper, colder, and full of malice. You are ready for your procedures, please proceed to the operating room. The door swung open, revealing a hallway bathed in harsh, sterile light. The faint sound of surgical saws and clinking metal could be heard from the distance. Leah shook her head, backing away. No, this is wrong, we can't. But there was no choice. The room they were in was shrinking, the walls slowly closing in on them. With no other options, they moved toward the door, every step filled with dread. As they passed through the door, they found themselves in a narrow corridor, the sterile light flickering ominously. The walls were lined with old, faded photographs, but as they moved closer, they realized that the pictures were of them, scenes from their pasts, moments they had forgotten or tried to bury. Chris saw a picture of himself as a child, alone in his bedroom, staring out of a window. Leah's photo showed her at her grandmother's funeral, tears streaking her face. Each photo seemed to tug at a memory they didn't want to relive. But the photos weren't just memories. As they passed each one, the pictures began to change. Their eyes in the photographs turned black, hollow and soulless, as if something was watching them through their own memories. Don't look at them, Chris warned, grabbing Leah's arm, just keep going. But it was too late. Sarah had stopped in front of one of her own photos, her face drained of color. The picture showed her as a young girl, but in the background, a shadowy figure loomed, watching her. That wasn't there before, she whispered. The shadow in the photograph began to move. Slowly, it shifted, turning its dark, featureless face toward them. Leah screamed as the shadow in the photograph began to push through the frame, its inky form dripping out into the hallway. The shadow that emerged from the photograph slithered across the floor like liquid darkness, moving toward the group with unnatural speed. Chris pulled Leah back as the shadow lunged, its shape twisting into something vaguely humanoid but monstrous. Run, he shouted, pushing the others forward as they sprinted down the corridor. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the sterile lights flickering overhead as the shadow pursued them. Its movements were erratic, like a predator toying with its prey. Every time they thought they'd escaped, it would appear ahead of them, its black form blocking the path. There's no way out. Danny shouted, his voice laced with panic. But just as they thought all hope was lost, the shadow halted, stopping just inches from them. The hallway around them flickered, the walls rippling like water, and then everything went dark. When the lights returned, they were no longer in the hallway. They found themselves back in the room with the beds and the box, but this time, something was different. The box that had contained their files now sat open, and inside, there was something new, a small, black object, smooth and featureless, like a stone. Leah reached for it, but Chris grabbed her arm. Don't touch it, this whole place is a trap. But Leah couldn't resist. The box seemed to pull her in, its dark power growing stronger the closer she got. She picked up the object, and as soon as she did, a deafening sound filled the room, a heartbeat, pounding louder and louder, until it was all they could hear. The asylum was alive. Suddenly, the beds began to move again, this time with purpose. The chains hanging from the ceiling snapped into place, wrapping around the limbs of Chris, Leah, Mike, Danny, and Sarah, pulling them toward the surgical tables. They struggled, screamed, but the chains were unbreakable. The operating lights flickered on above them, blinding in their intensity. The sound of surgical tools clattering onto trays echoed through the room, the instruments cold and sharp, gleaming with menace. The door opened, and in stepped Dr. Crane, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. "It's time for your surgeries." Chris tried to break free, but it was useless. The chains tightened around his wrists and ankles as the doctor approached, his scalpel glinting in the light. "There's no escape," Dr. Crane whispered, leaning down close to Chris's ear. "You belong to the asylum now." Just as Dr. Crane was about to begin, the black object in Leah's hand pulsed, sending out a wave of energy that knocked the doctor back. The chains loosened, and for a brief moment, they were free. Leah looked down at the stone in her hand, realizing that it held the key to their escape, or their doom. But before she could make a move, the ground beneath them cracked open, and they were falling once again, into the abyss. The asylum had one final test for them. Would they survive, or would they become part of its eternal nightmare? As the five of them stood in the final room, their breaths shallow, their bodies aching from the ordeal, an eerie silence settled over the group. The air was thick with unease, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something. The asylum had let them reach this point, but why? And why now, after everything, did they still feel trapped? It was Sarah who finally broke the silence. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried an unshakable weight. "How did this happen? How did we end up here?" She looked around at the others, her eyes wide with fear. Whose idea was it to come here in the first place? The question hung in the air, heavy and damning. Slowly, they all turned toward Chris. He was the one who had first suggested the asylum, the one who had convinced them that this night of exploration would be fun. Leah's face paled as she stared at him. "Chris, why? Why did you bring us here? How did you even know about this place?" Chris swallowed hard, his throat dry. He hadn't thought about it before, hadn't needed to. But now, with all eyes on him, memories long buried began to surface. I'm not sure," Chris stammered. "It was just a thought. I remember hearing about the asylum years ago, from some old local legend. I thought it would be a thrill, but..." "But what, Chris?" Leah pressed. "How did you really hear about it?" Chris hesitated, the words forming on his lips but reluctant to leave. Then, finally, he spoke. "I was a kid," Chris began, his voice distant. "I must have been about 7 or 8. My parents used to drive past this place on our way to visit my grandparents. Every time we passed it, I felt something strange. It was like the asylum was calling out to me." He paused, his brow furrowing as he tried to piece together the hazy memories. "One night, I had this dream, or at least I thought it was a dream. I was standing outside the gates of the asylum, and there was someone there, a man. He was wearing a long coat, his face hidden in shadow, but he spoke to me. He told me about the asylum, about how it wasn't just abandoned, it was waiting for me." Chris looked up at his friends, his eyes wide with fear. "I never told anyone about it, not even my parents, but that dream stuck with me. Over the years, it became an obsession. I started researching the asylum, learning about its dark past, and then, one day, I got the idea that we should come here. But it wasn't really my idea, was it? It was planted there, by him." "Who is him, Chris?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Chris replied, his voice shaking, "but I think he's the reason we're here. He's been pulling the strings from the start." The group fell silent, the weight of Chris's confession sinking in. They had come to the asylum because of him, but it was clear now that they were all being manipulated. This place wasn't just a haunted ruin, it was a trap, set long ago. But why us? Mike muttered, glancing around the room, his nerves on edge. Why did he want us? Leah took a deep breath. It's not just us. This asylum has always been a place for the forgotten, for people who've lost their way. Dr. Crane, whoever, or whatever he was, his influence never left this place. He's been drawing people in for years, and now it's our turn. Danny clenched his fists, a surge of defiance rising in him. But that doesn't mean we have to stay. There has to be a way out, some kind of clue that we missed. Chris's eyes fell to the files they had found earlier, the ones detailing their supposed surgeries. His fingers traced the edges of his file, the words, procedure, and operation, standing out like a warning, but then something else caught his eye. The numbers at the bottom of the page, they weren't just dates, they were coordinates. He looked up, excitement flashing in his eyes. Guys, I think I found our way out. Following the coordinates from their files, they navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the asylum, each step taking them deeper into the forgotten parts of the building. The walls around them grew more decrepit, and the stench of rot grew stronger. Eventually, they found themselves in front of a large metal door, rusted, ancient, and covered in strange symbols. It was unlike anything they had seen before. Above the door, faint words were scratched into the metal. For those who seek the light, follow the path of shadows. Chris hesitated, then reached for the door. With a groan, it swung open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into complete darkness. Do we really have a choice? Leah asked, her voice barely audible. Without waiting for an answer, Chris stepped forward, and the others followed. The stairs seemed to go on forever, the oppressive darkness pressing in around them. They could hear whispers, faint, indistinct voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. But they kept moving forward, driven by the hope that this was their way out. When they finally reached the bottom, they found themselves in a massive, underground chamber. In the center of the chamber was an altar, and on it lay a single, flickering candle. The flame danced in the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. Chris approached the candle cautiously. As he neared it, the shadows began to move, taking shape, forming into the figure of a man. It was the same man from his childhood dream, the one who had led him here. The shadow man smiled. You've done well to make it this far, but the real test begins now. The shadow man's form twisted and writhed, filling the chamber with a malevolent presence. He raised his hand, and the room began to tremble, the walls cracked, and the ceiling started to collapse. Run! Chris shouted. They sprinted for the far side of the room, where a small tunnel led upwards. Stones and debris fell around them as they scrambled through the tight passageway. The ground shook violently beneath them, as though the very asylum was trying to keep them trapped inside. As they ran, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The shadows reached out, trying to pull them back, but they pushed forward, driven by sheer desperation. Finally, they burst out into the open air. The cold night greeted them, and they collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. The first light of dawn was just beginning to break over the horizon. They had escaped. As they walked away from the asylum, relief washed over them. The nightmare was over, or so they thought. Just as the first rays of sunlight touched the ground, a blood-curdling scream echoed from behind them. It came from the asylum, loud, vicious, and filled with rage. "Where do you think you're going?" the voice snarled. They turned back to see the asylum, its windows glowing with an unnatural light. The shadowy figure of Dr. Crane loomed in the doorway, his laughter echoing in the distance. The group stood frozen for a moment, fear gripping them once again. But they turned away, moving faster, determined not to look back. The nightmare may not have been over, but they were no longer its prisoners. For now.